Powerful Viking sails to a quiet village, armed to take whatever he wants. But when he sees a beautiful young widow and her children, he hesitates, and everything begins to change. What could make a warrior question his very purpose? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The dawn broke cold and gray over the Norwegian fjord, painting the waters in shades of steel and silver. Mist clung to the surface like a living thing, reluctant to surrender to the pale morning light. The longship cut through the waves with practiced ease, its dragon-carved prow rising and falling with the rhythm of the sea. 20 men sat at the oars, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, their muscles working in perfect synchronization as they propelled the vessel forward through the icy waters. At the helm stood Halvard Stormborn, a man whose very presence commanded attention and respect. His frame was powerful and imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years wielding sword and axe in battle. His hair, the color of dark honey touched by firelight, fell past his shoulders in thick waves that he kept partially braided in the warrior tradition of his people. His beard, meticulously groomed despite the harsh conditions of sea travel, framed a face that was both handsome and intimidating. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of storm clouds gave him an appearance that had caused many enemies to hesitate before engaging him in combat. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a memento from a battle 3 winters past, adding to his fearsome reputation rather than diminishing his striking features. He wore a thick woolen cloak dyed deep crimson, fastened at his shoulder with a silver brooch worked in the shape of a raven. Beneath it he had donned a leather jerkin reinforced with iron rings, worn over a tunic of undyed wool. His sword, a magnificent weapon named Frostbite, hung at his left hip, its pommel wrapped in worn leather that had been shaped by his grip over countless battles. At his right side hung a bearded axe, its edge honed to razor sharpness, ready to split shields and helms alike. Halvard was a jarl's son, second-born to Gunnar Ironhand, ruler of a prosperous settlement 3 days' sail to the north. As the younger son, he would not inherit his father's holdings, and so he had taken to the sea as so many second sons did, seeking fortune and glory through raiding and trading. At 28 winters, he had already earned himself a fearsome reputation as a warrior and leader of men. His crew trusted him implicitly, following him into situations that would have given other men pause, knowing that Halvard's strategic mind and combat prowess would see them through. The morning air carried the scent of salt and seaweed, mixed with the familiar smells of tar, wool, and unwashed men confined to a ship for days on end. Halvard inhaled deeply, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of their destination. They had been at sea for 4 days now, following reports from traders of a coastal village rich with grain stores and livestock, poorly defended and ripe for the taking. The village lay in Northumbria, on the eastern coast of what the locals called England, a land that had provided rich pickings for Norse raiders for generations. Jarl Halvard called out Leif the Red, his second-in-command and childhood friend, moving carefully along the deck to stand beside him. Leif was shorter but no less fierce, with a wild red beard and a collection of scars that told the story of a life lived in battle. The men are eager. We should reach the coast before midday if the winds hold. Halvard nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. The winds will hold, he said, his voice deep and carrying easily over the sound of waves and creaking timber. But remind the men that we take what we need efficiently. No unnecessary killing. We want livestock, grain, silver if they have it. The more we carry away, the richer we all become. Leif grinned, revealing several missing teeth. The men know the drill, Halvard, though you're softer than most raiders I've sailed with. Some would say too soft. Some would find themselves missing more than teeth if they said it to my face. Halvard replied with a slight smile, but there was no real warmth in it. There's no honor in slaughtering farmers and children, Leif. We take what makes us strong and leave them alive to rebuild. Dead men don't plant crops, and we may want to return in a few years for another harvest. It was a philosophy that had served Halvard well, though it set him apart from many of his contemporaries who raided with a brutality that left nothing but ashes and corpses in their wake. Halvard had learned from his father that true power came not from destruction, but from knowing when to show mercy and when to strike with devastating force. A reputation for being ruthless but fair meant that sometimes villages would surrender their goods without a fight, saving both sides from bloodshed and making the raid far more profitable with fewer losses. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the longship continued its journey south. The men took turns at the oars, maintaining their strength for what was to come. Some checked their weapons, running whetstones along blade edges with the practiced patience of experienced warriors. Others adjusted their armor, tightening straps and ensuring that everything sat correctly. A few sat in quiet contemplation, perhaps thinking of home, perhaps of the coming action, perhaps praying to the gods for protection and success. Halvard's mind wandered as he maintained his vigil at the helm. He thought of his father's hall, of the warmth of the great hearth and the laughter of his kinsmen during the long winter nights. He thought of his older brother, Ulf, who would inherit everything, and who had never understood Halvard's need to prove himself beyond the shadow of their father's achievements. He thought of the women who had shared his bed over the years, pleasant companions for a night or a season, but none who had stirred anything deeper within his heart. At 28, most men of his station would have taken a wife, started building a family and a legacy of their own. But Halvard had always felt that something was missing, some piece of himself that remained undiscovered. The sea had become his true home, the deck of a longship more familiar than any hall. The brotherhood of his crew, forged in shared danger and triumph, meant more to him than the political maneuvering and social obligations of his father's court. Out here, on the whale road as the poets called it, a man's worth was measured in his courage, his skill, and his loyalty to his companions. It was pure in a way that life on land could never be. "Land!" The cry came from Torsten, positioned at the prow as lookout. "I see the coast." Every man aboard turned his eyes forward, energy rippling through the crew like electricity through storm clouds. Halvard felt his own pulse quicken, the familiar anticipation of action to come. This was the moment he lived for, the razor's edge between planning and execution, when everything hung in perfect balance before chaos descended. "Ship oars," Halvard commanded, his voice carrying authority. "We'll approach under sail alone, quietly. I want to see the lay of the land before we commit." The men complied immediately, drawing in the long oars with practiced efficiency and securing them along the length of the ship. The square sail, already unfurled, caught the wind and drove them steadily toward the coastline that was now visible as a dark line against the lighter sky. As they drew closer, details began to emerge from the morning haze. The village was small, perhaps 20 or 30 structures clustered around a natural harbor formed by a curve in the rocky coastline. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, indicating that the inhabitants were going about their morning routines, unaware of the danger approaching from the sea. Fields surrounded the settlement, the autumn grain already harvested and no doubt stored in barns and root cellars. Halvard could see livestock in pens near some of the buildings, cattle and sheep that would fetch good prices at home or provide food for his crew. What he did not see was any significant defensive preparation. There was no wall around the village, no watchtower, no guards visible along the shore. It was exactly as the traders had described, a prosperous but poorly defended settlement, the kind that had become increasingly common as the people of these lands grew complacent, forgetting the lessons of earlier raids. "Too easy," muttered Leif, echoing Halvard's own thoughts. "Makes me wonder if it's a trap." "No trap," Halvard said, though he understood his friend's caution. "Just people who've been fortunate enough not to face raiders in recent years. They've grown soft, forgotten to fear the sea." He paused, studying the village with the eye of an experienced warrior. "We'll beach north of the harbor, come at them from the inland side. Half the men with me, half stay with the ship under your command, Leif. If anything goes wrong, be ready to depart immediately." "Aye," Leif agreed, "though if something goes wrong, I'm coming to pull your stubborn hide out of whatever trouble you've found." Halvard allowed himself a genuine smile at that. "I'd expect nothing less, old friend." The longship glided smoothly toward the beach Halvard had indicated, a stretch of sand and smooth stones about 300 paces north of the village proper. The men moved with quiet efficiency, preparing their weapons and gear with minimal noise. These were veterans, men who had raided together for years, and they knew their business. As the keel scraped bottom, men leaped over the sides into the shallow water, hauling the ship up onto the beach with practiced teamwork. Halvard was among the first off, his boots crunching on the wet stones as he surveyed their landing site. The beach was sheltered by low hills covered in tough coastal grass, providing excellent concealment from the village. "Orm, Knut, Ingvar, you're with me," Halvard commanded, pointing to 3 of his most trusted warriors. "We scout ahead, see exactly what we're dealing with. The rest of you, prepare to move on my signal, but stay hidden here." The 3 men nodded and fell into formation behind their leader. Halvard led them up the slope, moving with a stealth that seemed at odds with his considerable size. Years of hunting in the forests of Norway had taught him how to move quietly, how to use terrain and shadows to remain unseen. They crested the hill and found themselves looking down at the village from an elevated position that gave them an excellent view of the entire settlement. From this vantage point, Halvard could see that the village was even less prepared than he had initially thought. People moved about their morning tasks with no sense of urgency or concern. Women carried water from a well in the village center. Men tended to animals or worked at various trades. Children played in the dirt streets, their laughter carrying faintly on the morning breeze. It was peaceful, ordinary, utterly defenseless. Something twisted uncomfortably in Halvard's chest, a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. He had raided dozens of villages over the years, taken goods and livestock, fought men who defended their homes, but there was something about seeing this particular scene, this slice of innocent domestic life, that gave him pause. "Easy pickings," Orm whispered, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "We'll be loaded and gone before noon." "There," Knut pointed toward a building slightly larger than the others, positioned near the center of the village. "That's likely where they store the grain, and those pens have good cattle, at least a dozen head." Halvard studied the village more carefully, his tactical mind automatically cataloging distances, escape routes, potential complications. His gaze swept across the various buildings, noting which were homes, which were workshops, which were storage, and then his eyes fell upon a particular dwelling near the eastern edge of the settlement, and something made him look more closely. It was a modest home, timber-framed with a thatched roof, distinguishable from the others only by the small garden beside it, carefully tended even this late in the season. As Halvard watched, the door opened and a woman emerged, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the world as he knew it. She was beautiful in a way that struck him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and stopping his heart for a long moment before it resumed beating with thunderous force. Her hair was the color of spun gold, falling in long waves past her shoulders, catching the morning light and seeming to glow with an inner radiance. Even from this distance, he could see that her features were delicate and refined, her movements graceful as she walked from her door toward the well in the village center. She wore a simple dress of undyed wool, belted at the waist, with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. The clothing was plain, the garb of a common villager, but she wore it with an unconscious elegance that would have put noble ladies to shame. There was something in the way she moved, a quiet dignity and strength that drew Halvard's attention and held it with invisible chains. As she walked, 2 small children emerged from the house behind her, a boy of perhaps 6 winters and a girl who could not have been more than 4. They ran to catch up with their mother, and she turned to smile at them, saying something that made the boy laugh and take his sister's hand. The gesture was so tender, so full of love and care, that Halvard felt something crack in the armor he had built around his heart. "Halvard," Ingvar's voice broke through his reverie. "Are you well? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Halvard shook his head slightly, trying to clear the strange fog that had descended on his thoughts. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. "Just thinking." But he wasn't fine. Something profound had just happened, something he didn't understand and couldn't name. He had seen beautiful women before, had betted his share and more. But this was different. This was not simple physical attraction, though he certainly felt that. This was something deeper, something that resonated in a part of himself he hadn't known existed. Who was she? The question burned in his mind. A farmer's wife, clearly, given the modest home and the children. But where was her husband? Halvard scanned the village again, looking for a man who might be connected to the golden-haired woman. But from this distance and angle, it was impossible to identify individuals clearly. "We should return to the ship," Knut suggested. "Make our plan of attack." Attack. The word felt wrong suddenly, distasteful in a way it never had before. Halvard watched as the woman reached the well, setting down her bucket and beginning to draw water. She laughed at something one of her children said, the sound not quite reaching him, but the joy evident in her expression. She was alive, vital, full of light and warmth, going about the simple business of caring for her family. And he was about to descend upon her world like a wolf among sheep, to take everything she had worked for, to fill her life with terror and loss. The realization settled over him like a heavy cloak, and for the first time in his raiding career, Halvard Stormborn questioned what he was about to do. Halvard remained motionless on the hillside, his eyes fixed on the golden-haired woman as she finished drawing water from the well. The morning sun had fully risen now, burning away the last vestiges of mist and bathing the village in clear autumn light. He watched as she hoisted the wooden bucket with practiced ease, balancing it on her hip while simultaneously keeping watch over her two children who played nearby. There was such capability in her movements, such quiet competence, that it spoke of a woman who had learned to manage life's burdens largely on her own. "Halvard," Orm said again, more insistently this time. "The men are waiting. What are your orders?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer that Halvard found himself strangely reluctant to give. His entire adult life had been built around moments like this, the careful planning and swift execution of raids that had made him wealthy and respected among his people. He had never hesitated before, never questioned the rightness of taking what he could from those too weak to defend it. That was the way of the world, the natural order of things. The strong took from the weak, and the weak either grew stronger or perished. It was brutal but honest, a truth as fundamental as the changing of seasons or the rising of the tide. But now, looking down at this village, at this woman and her children, something within him rebelled against that simple philosophy. He thought of his own mother, dead these 10 years past, and how she had struggled to raise him and his brother after their father had spent months away on trading voyages. He remembered the worry in her eyes during those long absences, the way she had rationed food to ensure her children never went hungry, even when supplies ran low. This woman below, whoever she was, surely carried similar burdens, faced similar struggles. "Tell the men to hold position," Halvard said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "I need to think." Ingvar and Knut exchanged confused glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to this uncharacteristic indecision from their normally decisive leader. It was Orm who spoke, his tone carefully neutral. "Think about what exactly?" "We've scouted the target. It's even easier than we hoped. We should strike now while we have surprise on our side." "I know what we should do," Halvard snapped, then immediately regretted his harsh tone. These men trusted him, followed him, deserved better than to have their leader's confusion inflicted upon them. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak more calmly. "Return to the ship. Tell Leif I'll join them shortly. I want to observe the village a while longer. Make certain there are no hidden defenses or unexpected complications." It was a flimsy excuse, and all three men knew it, but they were disciplined enough not to question their Jarl's son directly. They nodded and began making their way back down the hill, leaving Halvard alone with his tumultuous thoughts and the village spread out below him like a living map. The woman had finished her task at the well and was now making her way back toward her home, the children following in her wake like ducklings behind their mother. Halvard shifted position slightly to keep her in view, moving along the hillside with the unconscious stealth of a predator tracking prey. But he didn't feel like a predator now. He felt like something else entirely, something he couldn't name, as if he were on the edge of a precipice looking down into unknown depths. As the woman approached her home, the door opened, and an older woman emerged, gray-haired and bent with age. The two women spoke briefly, and Halvard saw the younger woman hand over the water bucket before the elder disappeared back inside. Then the golden-haired woman knelt down, bringing herself to her children's level, and spoke to them with evident affection. The boy nodded seriously at whatever she said, then took his sister's hand and led her around the side of the house, presumably to play in the garden Halvard had noticed earlier. The woman stood, brushing dirt from her dress, and for a moment she simply stood there, her face turned up toward the sky. Even from this distance, Halvard could see the weariness in her posture, the weight of responsibility that pressed down upon her shoulders. But there was also strength there, a resilience that spoke of a will that refused to break no matter how heavy the burden became. Who was she? question consumed him now, driving out all other considerations. He needed to know her name, her story, why she seemed to bear her responsibilities alone. Where was the man who should have been helping her, protecting her, easing her load? The children were young enough that their father should still be in his prime, capable of working the land and providing for his family. Yet Halvard had seen no sign of any man connected to this household. Perhaps he was in the fields, or away at some task that required his attention elsewhere in the village. The rational part of Halvard's mind suggested this obvious explanation. But something deeper, some instinct he had learned to trust over years of reading situations and people, told him that this was not the case. This woman had the bearing of someone who had learned to stand alone, who no longer expected anyone else to shoulder her burdens. A widow, perhaps. The thought struck him with unexpected force. Yes, that would explain everything he had observed. A widow left to raise her children alone, to manage a household and a farm without the support that should have been her right. It was a harsh fate, but not an uncommon one. Men died in accidents, in illness, in the countless small disasters that could befall those who worked the land or the sea, and their women were left behind to cope as best they could. The realization should have made his task easier. A widow would have no husband to fight for her, no man's blood that would need to be shed in the taking of her possessions. It should have simplified everything. Instead, it made the knot in his chest pull tighter, the reluctance he felt grow stronger rather than weaker. Halvard watched as the woman entered her home, disappearing from view. He remained on the hillside for a long moment, struggling with a decision that should have been simple but had somehow become impossibly complex. Below him, the village continued its peaceful morning routines, utterly unaware of the armed men waiting just beyond the hill, of the danger that crouched at their doorstep like a wolf waiting to spring. Finally, with a growl of frustration at his own indecision, Halvard turned and made his way back down the hill toward the beach where his ship waited. His men looked up expectantly as he approached, their faces showing a mixture of eagerness and confusion at the delay. Leif stood at the prow, his expression concerned rather than impatient. "Well?" Leif asked as Halvard drew near. "What did you see that has you moving like a man walking to his own funeral?" Halvard ignored the question, instead gathering his crew around him with a gesture. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on him, waiting for his commands, trusting in his leadership as they always had. The weight of that trust settled on him alongside all his other burdens. "The village is as poorly defended as we were told," Halvard began, his voice carrying easily to all assembled. "No walls, no guards, no significant fighting force that I could observe. The grain stores are full, the livestock pens well stocked. It's everything we hoped for and more." A ripple of satisfaction ran through the men, smiles appearing on weathered faces. This was what they had come for, what they had spent 4 days at sea to achieve. Easy wealth, minimal risk, a successful raid to boast about when they returned home. However, Halvard continued, and the single word was enough to wipe the smiles away, replacing them with uncertainty and confusion. "We're going to approach this differently than we originally planned." "Differently how?" asked Gunther, one of the older warriors, his scarred face creasing with a frown. "A raid is a raid, Halvard. We've done this 100 times. Not like this," Halvard said firmly. "We're going to walk into that village openly, weapons sheathed. We're going to announce ourselves and give them a choice. They can surrender their grain and livestock peacefully, accept our terms for tribute, and no blood will be shed. Or they can resist, and we will take what we want by force." The announcement was met with stunned silence. Leif was the first to find his voice, stepping forward with an expression that mixed concern with disbelief. "Halvard, that's madness. You're throwing away our advantage of surprise. You're giving them time to organize a defense, to hide their valuables, to send riders for help from neighboring settlements. I'm giving them a choice," Halvard corrected, his tone brooking no argument. "And I'm giving us a chance to profit without unnecessary bloodshed. Dead farmers don't pay tribute, Leif. If we can establish a regular arrangement with this village, we can return year after year and take a portion of their harvest without having to fight for it each time. It's better business in the long run." It was a logical argument, and one that had worked in the past when Halvard had used similar tactics with other settlements. But he knew, and from the look on Leif's face his friend knew as well, that logic was not truly driving this decision. Something else was at work here, something that Halvard himself did not fully understand. "And if they refuse?" Orm asked. If they choose to fight, then we fight, Halvard said simply. And we take everything, as originally planned. But I believe they'll be smart enough to accept the alternative. People value their lives and the lives of their children more than they value their possessions. They'll see reason. Leif studied his friend's face for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching for something. Whatever he saw there seemed to give him pause, but finally he nodded slowly. Very well. It's your raid, your decision. The men will follow your lead, as always. But Halvard? He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Halvard could hear. What's really going on here? In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you hesitate like this. What happened up on that hill? Halvard met his friend's eyes, saw the genuine concern there, the worry of a man who had stood beside him through countless battles and storms. He wanted to explain, to put into words the strange transformation that had come over him when he saw the golden-haired woman. But how could he explain what he himself didn't understand? How could he make sense of the way his entire world-view had shifted in the space of a few heartbeats? I saw something that made me think, Halvard said finally. That's all. Sometimes it's worth considering whether the old ways are always the best ways. Leif didn't look convinced, but he nodded and stepped back. Your father always said you thought too much for a warrior. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps. Halvard agreed with a slight smile. But my thinking has kept us all alive and wealthy thus far, hasn't it? Aye, it has, Leif conceded. So we trust it now as well. Men. He raised his voice to address the crew. You heard Halvard. Weapons sheathed unless he gives the order otherwise. We walk in peacefully and let them make their choice. Any man who draws steel without permission will answer to me. Understood. A chorus of acknowledgement rose from the assembled warriors. They might not understand or fully agree with Halvard's decision, but they trusted his leadership enough to follow even when the path seemed strange. It was a trust that Halvard felt keenly, adding to the weight of responsibility he already carried. Form up, Halvard commanded, taking his position at the head of the group. We approach from the main road, in plain sight. Let them see us coming. I want no one in that village to have any excuse to claim we attacked without warning. The men arranged themselves in a loose formation, instinctively organizing by battle experience with the veterans at the front and the younger warriors toward the rear. They were an imposing sight, even with weapons sheathed, 20 large men in armor and furs, bearing shields and wearing the confidence of warriors who had tested themselves in battle and emerged victorious. The people of the village would know immediately what they were, what they represented, the threat they posed. Halvard led them up and over the hill, then down the road that led into the village proper. As they crested the rise and came into view, he saw the first villager spot them. It was a man working in a field, his hoe frozen mid-swing as he stared at the approaching warriors. For a moment he simply stood there, paralyzed by shock or fear or disbelief. Then his hoe fell from nerveless fingers and he began running toward the village, his voice raised in alarm. Raiders! Vikings! To arms! The cry spread through the village like wildfire, transforming the peaceful morning scene into sudden chaos. People appeared from houses and workshops, some running for cover, others snatching up children and herding them to safety. A few men emerged, bearing whatever weapons they could grab, mostly farming tools and a handful of old swords or spears, forming a ragged defensive line in the village center. It was pathetic as far as defenses went. Perhaps 15 men of varying ages and capabilities, some clearly past their prime, others barely old enough to grow beards. They were farmers and craftsmen, not warriors, and the terror in their eyes was plainly visible even from a distance. But they stood their ground nonetheless, and Halvard felt a grudging respect for their courage even as he recognized how futile their resistance would be if it came to battle. Halvard raised his hand, signaling his men to halt about 50 paces from the defensive line. Then he stepped forward alone, his hands well clear of his weapons, presenting himself as a target if anyone was foolish enough to take a shot. Behind him he heard Leif mutter a curse, clearly unhappy with his friend's exposure to danger, but no countermanding order came. This was Halvard's plan, his gambit, and he would see it through. I am Halvard Stormborn, son of Jarl Gunnar Ironhand of the northern settlements, he called out, his powerful voice carrying easily across the distance. I come to speak with whoever leads this village. I offer you a choice between peace and violence, between cooperation and conquest. Who among you speaks for your people? For a long moment there was no response. The defenders exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for this approach. Raiders were supposed to attack, to kill and burn and plunder. They weren't supposed to stop and ask for negotiations. The unexpectedness of it had thrown them completely off balance. Finally, an older man stepped forward from the defensive line. He was perhaps 60 winters old, his hair more gray than brown, his face lined with years of sun and work. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he carried himself with the bearing of authority despite the fear that Halvard could see lurking beneath his composed exterior. "I am Aldrich, headman of this village," the old man said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "What terms do you offer, Norseman? What choice do we truly have when you come armed and ready for war?" Halvard studied the old headman carefully, noting the intelligence in those weathered eyes, the way Aldrich positioned himself to shield the younger men behind him despite his age. This was a man who had lived long enough to accumulate wisdom, who understood that sometimes survival required pragmatism rather than heroism. Good. That would make this easier. "The choice is real, Aldrich of this village," Halvard replied, pitching his voice so that all could hear, both his own men and the villagers. "I did not sail 4 days across the whale road to make false promises or play games with words. Here are my terms, simple and clear. You will provide us with half of your grain stores, 10 head of cattle, 20 sheep, and whatever silver or valuable goods you can spare. In return, we depart peacefully. No blood is shed, no buildings are burned, no women are violated, no children are harmed." He paused, letting the terms sink in, watching the reactions ripple through both groups. His own men shifted uneasily, clearly thinking that he was asking for less than they could simply take by force. The villagers looked equally uncertain, perhaps suspecting a trap, perhaps simply shocked that they were being offered any terms at all. "Furthermore," Halvard continued, "this village will be under my protection. Any other raiders who come to these shores will find themselves facing the wrath of Halvard Stormborn and his crew. You will pay tribute to me and me alone, and in return I guarantee your safety from all others who would do you harm. In 1 year's time I will return, and you will provide the same tribute again. As long as you honor this arrangement, you have my word as a warrior and as my father's son that no harm will come to you or yours from any Norseman." The silence that followed was profound. Aldrich's expression shifted from fear to calculation, his sharp mind clearly working through the implications of what was being offered. It was, in truth, not a terrible arrangement from the village's perspective. Half their stores would be painful but not catastrophic, especially this early in autumn with most of the harvest already complete. The livestock represented a significant loss, but again, not one they couldn't recover from, and the promise of protection from other raiders was worth a great deal in these uncertain times. "And if we refuse?" Aldrich asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "If we choose to fight rather than submit to your demands?" Halvard's expression hardened, the warrior in him rising to the surface. "Then my men and I will take everything. Your grain stores, your livestock, your silver, your tools, your possessions. We will leave you with nothing but your lives, and those only because I choose to be merciful. Your village will be left destitute, barely able to survive the coming winter, and you will have no guarantee that we won't return next year to take whatever you've managed to rebuild, or that other raiders won't follow in our wake, drawn by stories of an easy target." He let that sink in for a moment, then softened his tone slightly. "I am offering you a partnership, Aldrich. A harsh one, perhaps, from your perspective, but partnerships require both sides to benefit. You get protection and predictability. You know exactly what you'll lose and when, and you know that if you meet your obligations, you'll be left in peace to prosper. That's more than most raiders would offer you. That's more than most villages in your position ever receive." Aldrich turned to confer with the men behind him, their voices too low for Halvard to hear clearly, but their body language speaking volumes. Some were clearly arguing for resistance, young men whose pride rebelled against the idea of submission. Others, older and presumably wiser, were nodding in agreement with whatever Aldrich was saying. The debate went on for several minutes while Halvard waited with apparent patience, though his mind was racing with contingencies and possibilities. His eyes roamed over the assembled villagers, searching without quite meaning to for a glimpse of golden hair among the crowd. Where was she? Had she fled with the other women and children, seeking safety in the woods or in some hidden cellar? Or was she somewhere in the village, watching these proceedings with the same fear and uncertainty that marked every face he could see. Finally, Aldrich turned back to face Halvard, his decision apparently made. "You give us your word, your oath before your gods and ours, that if we agree to these terms, no harm will come to our people? That you and your men will take only what you've named and nothing more?" "I swear it by Odin All-Father, and by Thor the Thunderer," Halvard said solemnly, placing his hand over his heart in the traditional gesture of oath-taking, "and by whatever gods you hold sacred as well. My word is my bond, and I have never broken an oath in all my years. Ask any man who knows me, and they will tell you that Halvard Stormborn's word is as solid as stone and as unchanging as the northern star." Behind him, he heard Leif grunt in acknowledgement, and several of his other men murmured agreement. Whatever else might be said about their leader, his reputation for keeping his promises was well established and well deserved. It was part of what made him effective in negotiations like these. People believed him when he made commitments because he had proven time and again that he would honor them. Aldrich studied Halvard's face for a long moment, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. The old headman's shoulders slumped slightly, the tension draining out of him as he accepted the inevitable. "Very well, Halvard Stormborn. We accept your terms. We will provide the tribute you demand, and we will consider ourselves under your protection from this day forward." A collective exhalation seemed to pass through both groups, tension releasing like a bowstring after the arrow has flown. Halvard's men relaxed their stances, no longer poised for immediate combat. The villagers lowered their makeshift weapons, relief washing over their faces as they realized they would live to see another day, that their children would not be orphaned, that their homes would not be reduced to ash and ember. "You have made the wise choice, Aldrich," Halvard said, allowing a small smile to cross his features. "I will have my men begin collecting the tribute. It will be done respectfully and without violence, you have my word. Perhaps you would be willing to show me your grain stores. It will be easier if we work together to measure out the portions rather than having my men search for themselves." Aldrich nodded slowly, gesturing for Halvard to follow him. "This way. The main stores are in the long building near the center of the village. I'll have some of the younger men drive the livestock to your ship once you've selected which animals you want." As they walked through the village together, an unlikely pair united by necessity and mutual benefit, Halvard became acutely aware of the eyes watching them from doorways and windows. Women mostly, clutching children close, their faces pale with fear and relief in equal measure. He kept his expression neutral, non-threatening, wanting them to see that he was a man of his word, that their safety was genuinely assured as long as the terms were met. And then he saw her. She stood in the doorway of her modest home, one hand gripping the doorframe as if needing its support, the other resting protectively on the shoulder of her young son who stood before her. The little girl was nowhere to be seen, presumably hidden safely inside. Her golden hair caught the sunlight, seeming to glow with an inner fire, and even from across the village square Halvard could see the fear in her eyes, the tension in every line of her body. But there was something else there too. Defiance, determination, the look of a mother prepared to die defending her children if necessary, consequences be damned. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing Halvard had ever seen, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow, stopping his feet in their tracks and stealing the breath from his lungs. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the distance. Halvard saw her stiffen, saw recognition of what he was flash across her features. She knew he was the leader, the one who held her fate and the fate of everyone she loved in his hands. And yet she didn't look away, didn't cower or retreat. She met his gaze steadily, this golden-haired widow with her fierce protective love and her quiet dignity, and something passed between them in that moment, some connection that Halvard felt in the deepest parts of his being. "That's Rowena." Aldrich's voice broke the spell, and Halvard realized he had been staring. "Her husband Edmund died 2 winters past. Fever took him. She's been managing their farm alone since then, her and old Mildred who lives with her. Good woman, works harder than most men I know. Her children are young yet, but the boy helps as he can." Halvard forced himself to look away, to turn his attention back to Aldrich, though every fiber of his being wanted to continue staring at the woman called Rowena. "She manages a farm alone, with only an old woman and 2 small children to help her?" "Aye," Aldrich confirmed, a note of respect in his voice. The other families help when they can, of course. We look after our own here. But Rowena is proud, doesn't like to ask for assistance unless absolutely necessary. She's determined to prove she can stand on her own, provide for her children without becoming a burden to anyone else. Pride and stubbornness, Halvard thought. A dangerous combination, but also an admirable one. He understood that drive, that need to prove oneself capable and independent. He had felt it himself, being the second son, always in his brother's shadow, always needing to demonstrate that he was worthy in his own right. Her tribute will be paid from the communal stores, Halvard heard himself say, the words emerging before he had fully thought them through. She shouldn't have to bear an individual burden on top of everything else she carries. Aldrich looked at him with surprise, his eyebrows rising. That's generous of you, Norseman. More generous than I would have expected from a raider. I told you, Halvard said, his voice harder than necessary to cover the unexpected emotion churning in his chest. This is a partnership, not a conquest. I have no interest in grinding your people into the dirt. I want you prosperous enough to continue paying tribute year after year. Leaving a widow destitute serves no one's interests. It was a logical explanation, and Aldrich seemed to accept it with a nod. But Halvard knew, even if he wasn't ready to fully admit it to himself, that logic had nothing to do with his decision. He simply could not bear the thought of taking anything from Rowena, of adding to the burdens she already carried, of seeing fear or despair in those eyes that had met his with such fierce courage. They reached the grain storage building, and Halvard forced his attention to the practical matters at hand. The stores were indeed substantial, more than enough to meet his demands with plenty left over for the village to survive the winter comfortably. He and Aldrich worked out the details of the division, marking which sacks would be taken and which would remain. Leif joined them, bringing several of the crew to begin the work of hauling the tribute back to the ship. As the morning wore on, the village gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though tension still crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. The villagers went about their tasks with nervous energy, watching the Norse warriors move through their settlement with wary eyes. For their part, Halvard's men behaved with admirable discipline, taking only what had been agreed upon and treating the villagers with rough but genuine respect. Halvard found excuses to move through different parts of the village, ostensibly supervising the collection of tribute but in reality hoping for another glimpse of Rowena. He saw her once more, working in her garden with fierce concentration, pulling up the last of the autumn vegetables with more force than strictly necessary. Her children played nearby, and the old woman Aldrich had mentioned, Mildred presumably, sat on a stool outside the house, watching over them with the vigilant eyes of a grandmother. Rowena did not look up as Halvard passed, though he was certain she was aware of his presence. There was something in the set of her shoulders, the tension in her movements, that spoke of acute consciousness of being observed. He wanted to speak to her, to hear her voice, to somehow communicate that she had nothing to fear from him. But what could he say? What words could bridge the gulf between them, between raider and victim, between the man who had threatened her world and the woman who had captured his heart without even trying? By early afternoon, the tribute had been collected and hauled to the beach. The cattle and sheep had been driven there as well, though that had been a chaotic process involving much shouting and chasing of stubborn animals. Halvard's men were in good spirits, pleased with the haul, and relieved that they had acquired it without having to fight. Even those who had been skeptical of Halvard's approach had to admit that it had worked out better than expected. Halvard stood with Aldrich at the edge of the village, preparing to take his leave. "We'll return in 1 year," he said formally. "I expect the same tribute to be ready. If you've had a particularly good harvest, I might be willing to negotiate the amount. If you've had a poor one, we can discuss that as well. I'm not unreasonable." "And your protection?" Aldrich asked. "How will we contact you if other raiders come? How will they know we're under your shield?" It was a good question, one that Halvard had been pondering himself. "I'll leave you with this," he said, removing a leather cord from around his neck. Hanging from it was a small silver pendant worked in the shape of a raven, the symbol of his family line. "Display this prominently in your village center. Any Norse raider worth his salt will recognize the mark of Jarl Gunnar Ironhand. They'll know that taking from you means making an enemy of my father and his entire clan. That should be enough to deter most." Aldrich accepted the pendant with something approaching reverence, understanding the value of what was being offered. "And if it's not enough?" If someone decides your father's enmity is worth risking, then send word north, Halvard said. To the settlement of Ravensborg, 3 days' sail up the coast. Ask for Gunnar Ironhand or his sons. Word will reach me, and I will come. I protect what is mine, Aldrich. Remember that. As long as you honor our agreement, I will honor my protection. He turned to go, then paused, the question burning on his tongue, demanding to be released. The woman, Rowena, her farm, is it productive? Does she manage to support her family adequately? Aldrich's eyes sharpened, understanding flickering behind them. She does well enough. Why do you ask? No reason, Halvard said too quickly. Simply ensuring that all your people are capable of contributing to future tributes without hardship. The headman's expression suggested he didn't believe that explanation for a moment, but he was wise enough not to press. Rowena will manage. She always does. She's stronger than she looks, that one. Edmund was a fool to leave her, even if fever was what took him rather than choice. A fool indeed, Halvard agreed quietly. Then, before he could stop himself, before wisdom could prevail over impulse, he asked, Has there been talk of her remarrying? Surely the men of the village must see her value. Now Aldrich's expression shifted to something almost amused, a knowing look that made Halvard want to squirm like a boy caught stealing sweets. There's been talk, aye. Several men have approached her, offering marriage, offering to help with the farm and the children. She's refused them all. Says she's not ready, that she needs time to grieve properly, that her children need stability rather than a new father thrust upon them before they're ready. Sensible reasons, Halvard managed, though his heart had leaped inexplicably at the news that she had refused other suitors. Sensible, aye, Aldrich agreed, though between you and me I think there's more to it than that. I think Rowena loved her Edmund deeply, and she's not yet ready to let go of that love, not ready to make room in her heart for another. Some loves mark us too deeply to easily move past, especially when they're cut short before their time. The words struck Halvard with unexpected force, lodging somewhere deep in his chest like an arrow finding its mark. A woman who loved deeply, who remained faithful to her husband's memory even 2 years after his death, who refused easier paths out of loyalty to a ghost. It was both beautiful and tragic, and it made him want her even more intensely than before. The journey back to Norway should have been a time of celebration. The hold of the longship was laden with grain and supplies. The livestock had been secured and were manageable despite their bleeding protests, and not a single drop of blood had been shed. By any measure, the raid had been a complete success, perhaps one of the most profitable and cleanly executed ventures Halvard had ever led. His men sang rowing songs as they worked the oars, their voices carrying across the water in rough harmony, their spirits high with the prospect of returning home as wealthy men. Yet Halvard found no joy in their success. He stood at the stern, watching the English coastline recede into the distance, and felt as though he were leaving behind something infinitely more valuable than anything they carried in their hold. The image of Rowena haunted him, her golden hair catching the sunlight, her fierce protective stance in the doorway, the way her eyes had met his with such unflinching courage. He could not shake the memory, could not stop his mind from returning again and again to those few moments when their gazes had locked across the village square. "You're brooding," Leif observed, appearing at Halvard's elbow with the uncanny ability of old friends to know when they're needed. "You've been staring at that coastline like a man who's lost his most prized possession. Want to tell me what's really going on in that complicated head of yours?" Halvard considered deflecting, maintaining the pretense that everything was fine, that he was simply tired from the raid and the journey. But this was Leif, who had known him since they were boys, learning to swing practice swords in his father's training yard. Leif, who had stood beside him through countless battles and adventures, who had earned the right to honest answers through years of unwavering loyalty and friendship. "There was a woman," Halvard said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of waves and wind and rowing. "In the village, a widow with 2 young children." Leif was silent for a moment, processing this information and all its implications. When he spoke, his tone was carefully neutral. "There are many widows in many villages, Halvard. We've seen countless women in our travels. What made this one different?" "I don't know," Halvard admitted, and the confession felt like ripping something out of himself. "I saw her for perhaps 5 heartbeats total. We never spoke. I don't even know the sound of her voice. But Leif, when I looked at her, something changed. Something fundamental shifted inside me, like the world had been slightly off balance my entire life, and suddenly snapped into proper alignment. "That's madness talking," Leaf said, but there was more concern than dismissal in his voice. "You can't fall in love with someone you've never even spoken to. That's the stuff of scalds' tales, not real life." "I know," Halvard agreed. "Trust me, I know how it sounds. I've been telling myself the same thing for the entire journey back. But I can't stop thinking about her, Leaf. I close my eyes and I see her face. I wonder what her voice sounds like, what makes her laugh, how she manages to carry all those burdens alone. I wonder if she's warm enough at night, if she has enough food, if her children are happy." Leaf let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly. "You've got it bad, my friend. Worse than I've ever seen from you, and I've watched you chase plenty of women over the years. Though you've always lost interest once the chase was over, once the conquest was made. This feels different somehow." "Everything about this feels different," Halvard said. "I've never questioned a raid before, never hesitated, never felt this pull to go back. Part of me wanted to stay, wanted to find some excuse to remain in that village just to be near her. How insane is that?" "Fairly insane," Leif admitted honestly. "But then again, the gods work in mysterious ways, or so the priests always tell us. Maybe they have plans for you that don't involve spending your life raiding and pillaging. Maybe they're trying to tell you something." Halvard snorted. "What? That I should abandon everything I've built, everything I am, for a woman I don't even know? A woman who lives in a foreign land, who has every reason to hate me for what I represent, who is still mourning the husband she lost? That seems like the gods playing a cruel joke rather than offering divine guidance." "Perhaps," Leif conceded. "Or perhaps the gods are testing you, seeing if you're brave enough to pursue what your heart wants instead of what your pride demands. You've never lacked for physical courage, Halvard. You'll charge into battle against overwhelming odds without hesitation. But emotional courage, that's a different kind of bravery altogether, and one that many warriors never master." The word struck deeper than Halvard cared to admit. He had built his entire identity around being strong, fearless, unshakable. He had cultivated a reputation as a man who took what he wanted and never looked back, who moved through life with the certainty of someone who always knew exactly what he was doing. But Rowena had shattered that certainty, leaving him floundering in unfamiliar emotional waters, without map or compass to guide him. "What would you do?" Halvard asked after a long silence. "If you were in my position?" Leif considered the question seriously, staring out at the horizon where sea met sky in an endless line of blue. "Honestly, I don't know. My heart has never led me to such complicated places. I'm a simple man, Halvard. I like simple pleasures, simple problems, simple solutions. But you've never been simple, and I don't think the gods intend for you to have a simple life." He turned to face his friend fully, his expression grave. "What I do know is this. You're going to drive yourself mad if you spend the next year thinking about this woman constantly, wondering what might have been, torturing yourself with possibilities. So you have two choices as I see it. Either you find a way to forget her, to move on and focus on your life here, find yourself a good Norse woman to marry and settle down with, or you accept that this is going to haunt you until you do something about it." "Do something about it," Halvard repeated slowly. "Like what exactly?" "Sail back there, knock on her door, and announce that I've decided I want to court her. I'm a raider, Leif. I threatened her village, demanded tribute, represented everything she has reason to fear and despise. What possible reason would she have to give me the time of day, let alone consider any kind of relationship?" "You could start by talking to her," Leif suggested. "You know, that thing people do where they exchange words and ideas, get to know each other? You're good with words when you want to be, Halvard. You negotiated a peaceful tribute agreement with that entire village. Surely you can manage a conversation with one woman." "It's not that simple." "It never is," Leif agreed. "But nothing worth having ever comes easily, does it? You've fought for everything else in your life. Why should love be any different?" "Love." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities. Halvard wanted to deny it, to insist that what he felt was mere attraction, infatuation, a passing fancy that would fade with time and distance. But he had never been one to lie to himself, and he couldn't start now. What he felt for Rowena, impossible and irrational as it was, went far deeper than simple desire. The voyage continued. days blending together in the familiar rhythms of sea travel. They stopped at a trading post to sell some of the livestock, converting them into silver that would be easier to transport and divide among the crew. They weathered a storm that tested their seamanship and left everyone exhausted but unharmed. They sang songs and told stories, maintaining the camaraderie that had been forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. And through it all, Halvard thought of Rowena. He imagined conversations they might have, scenarios where he could win her trust, and perhaps eventually her affection. He created elaborate fantasies in which he somehow proved himself worthy of her despite everything that stood between them. And then he would remember the reality of their situation, the vast gulf that separated a Norse raider from an English widow, and the fantasies would crumble into dust. When they finally reached the Norwegian coast and began the final approach to his father's settlement, Halvard felt a familiar mix of homecoming joy and the weight of expectations. The lookout spotted their sail and raised the alarm, and by the time they beached the longship, a crowd had gathered to welcome them home. His father stood at the forefront, tall and imposing even in his 55th year. His iron-gray beard braided and adorned with silver rings, his eyes sharp and assessing as they took in the returning crew and their cargo. "Halvard," Jarl Gunnar Ironhand greeted his son, pulling him into a brief but fierce embrace before stepping back to examine him. "You return victorious, I see. The hold looks well stocked." "The raid was successful, father," Halvard confirmed. "We secured a substantial tribute and established a protection arrangement with the village. They'll provide the same tribute annually, and in return we ensure no other raiders trouble them." Gunnar's eyebrows rose, surprise and approval mingling in his expression. "A regular tribute arrangement? That's thinking ahead, my son. Better than simply bleeding them dry in one raid and leaving nothing for future harvests. Your brother would have done well to learn such strategic thinking." The mention of Ulf, Halvard's older brother and heir to their father's holdings, brought a familiar pang of complicated emotions. Ulf was a capable warrior and administrator, but he lacked imagination and tended toward brute force solutions rather than subtle diplomacy. The comparison was both flattering and frustrating, highlighting the skills that made Halvard valuable while simultaneously reminding him that those skills would never be enough to overcome the accident of birth order. "I learned from the best," Halvard said diplomatically. "You've always taught that smart raiding is more profitable than indiscriminate destruction." "True enough," Gunnar agreed. "Come, let's divide the spoils and celebrate your return properly. The hall is prepared for a feast, and your mother has been driving the thralls mad with preparations since the lookouts spotted your sail." The feast that night was everything such events were meant to be. Abundant food and flowing mead, boisterous conversation and competitive boasting, the warmth of community and the bonds of kinship reinforced through shared celebration. Halvard's men recounted the details of the raid, praising their leader's strategic thinking and the peaceful resolution that had netted them such rich rewards without cost in blood or injury. The skald composed verses on the spot, immortalizing the tale in the oral tradition that would preserve it for future generations. Yet Halvard found himself strangely detached from the festivities, participating mechanically while his thoughts remained thousands of miles away in a small English village. He drank but found no warmth in the mead. He laughed at jokes but felt no genuine mirth. He accepted congratulations and praise but felt no pride in his accomplishments. Everything felt hollow, empty, as if the success he had worked so hard to achieve was suddenly revealed to be meaningless. His mother, Sigrun, noticed his distraction. She was a formidable woman despite her advancing years, her hair still more gold than gray, her eyes missing nothing as she observed her youngest son from her place at the high table. After the formal portion of the feast concluded and people began breaking into smaller groups for conversation and gaming, she made her way to Halvard's side with the purposeful stride of a woman on a mission. "Walk with me," she commanded, rather than asked, and Halvard knew better than to refuse. They stepped out of the crowded, smoky hall into the cool evening air, the noise of celebration fading behind them as they walked toward the cliffs that overlooked the fjord. The view was spectacular, the water reflecting the last colors of sunset in shades of gold and crimson, the mountains rising dark and majestic against the darkening sky. It was a vista Halvard had seen countless times throughout his life, so familiar it had become invisible through repetition. But tonight it struck him with renewed force, the raw beauty of his homeland presenting itself as if for the first time. You've returned from a successful raid. Your men are celebrating your leadership. Your father is pleased with your strategic thinking, and yet you sit in the hall like a man attending his own funeral. Sigrun observed, her tone sharp, but not unkind. What troubles you, my son? And don't tell me nothing, I know that look. I wore it myself once, long ago. Halvard remained silent for a long moment, trying to find words to explain something he barely understood himself. Finally he said, "How did you know father was the right man for you? When he came to your father's hall seeking your hand, how did you know you wanted to accept?" Sigrun's expression softened with memory and perhaps a touch of surprise at the question. "I didn't know, not at first. Your father was arrogant and boastful, too sure of himself by half. I thought him insufferable, if I'm being honest. But there was something underneath all that swagger, something genuine and strong and worthy. I saw glimpses of it when he thought no one was watching, moments when his guard was down and his true character showed through." She turned to face her son fully, studying his face with a mother's intimate knowledge. "But more than that, I felt something when I looked at him. A recognition, as if some part of me had been waiting my whole life for him to arrive. Like finding the missing piece of a puzzle you didn't even know was incomplete. Does that sound like madness?" "No," Halvard said quietly. "It sounds exactly like what I needed to hear." Sigrun's eyes sharpened with understanding, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "So that's what this is about. You've met someone. On this raid, I presume?" Halvard nodded, finding it easier to confess to his mother than it had been to Leif. There was something about Sigrun's calm acceptance, her lack of judgment, that made vulnerability feel less dangerous. "A widow in the village we raided. I saw her for mere moments, never even spoke to her, but mother, I can't stop thinking about her. It's like she's taken up residence in my mind and refuses to leave." "And what are you planning to do about this?" Sigrun asked, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer. "I don't know," Halvard admitted. "The rational part of me says to forget her, that it's impossible, that I'm being foolish. But there's another part, a part I didn't even know existed until a few days ago, that keeps insisting I have to try, that I'll regret it for the rest of my life if I don't at least attempt to know her, to see if what I felt was real or just some flight of fancy." Sigrun was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting out over the darkening fjord. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Let me tell you something that very few people know. When your father came to my father's hall, I was already promised to another man, a jarl from the south, wealthy and powerful, a match that would have brought great advantage to my family. My father had accepted his suit, and I was expected to honor that arrangement." Halvard stared at his mother in shock. This was a piece of family history he had never heard, a secret that recontextualized everything he knew about his parents' relationship. "But you married father instead. What happened?" "Your father happened," Sigrun said with a soft laugh. "He arrived like a storm, declared that I was meant to be his, and proceeded to challenge everything I thought I knew about my own future. He was infuriating and presumptuous and completely certain that we belonged together. And somehow, against all logic and propriety, I found myself agreeing with him." She turned back to Halvard, her expression serious now. "It caused a tremendous scandal. The other jarl was insulted. My father was furious. Alliances were strained. But your father stood firm, and eventually, I found the courage to stand firm as well. We chose each other despite the obstacles, despite what everyone else thought we should do. And Halvard, I have never regretted that choice for a single moment in all the years since." "But that's different," Halvard protested. "You were both Norse, both from similar backgrounds. This woman, Rowena, she's English. She's Christian, where I honor the old gods. She's a widow with children, with responsibilities and a life rooted in her village. I'm a raider who threatened everything she holds dear. How can anything good come from such fundamental differences?" "Love doesn't ask permission to bloom in convenient soil," Sigrun replied. "It grows where it will, often in the most unlikely and challenging places. Yes, you face obstacles, significant ones. But are they truly insurmountable? Or are you simply afraid to try because failure might hurt less than never having attempted at all?" The question struck at the heart of Halvard's conflict, exposing the fear he had been trying to hide even from himself. He was afraid, not of battle or storms or physical danger, those he could face without hesitation, But this, the possibility of opening his heart to someone and being rejected, of trying for something precious and failing to achieve it, terrified him in ways that blades and axes never had. "What if I go back and she wants nothing to do with me?" Halvard asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "What if she sees me as nothing more than the raider who threatened her home, regardless of how peacefully the situation was resolved? What if I've built this all up in my head, and the reality is that we have nothing in common? No foundation for anything meaningful? Then at least you'll know," Sigrun said gently. "You'll have your answer, and you can move forward with certainty, rather than spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been. But Halvard, from what I see in your eyes when you speak of her, I don't think that's what will happen. I think you found something rare and precious, and I think you'll regret it forever if you let fear keep you from pursuing it." They stood together in comfortable silence, mother and son, watching the last light fade from the sky and the stars begin to emerge in their countless multitudes. Halvard felt something settling inside him, a decision crystallizing from the chaos of conflicting emotions and uncertainties. His mother was right. He had faced every other challenge in his life with courage and determination. This deserved no less. "I'm going back," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of commitment. "Not immediately, not tomorrow, but when spring comes and the seas are navigable again, I'm going back to that village. I'm going to speak to her, get to know her properly, and see if what I felt was real." Sigrun squeezed his arm affectionately. "Good. That's my son, the one who's never backed down from anything that mattered. Though I should warn you, your father may not be as understanding as I am. He has plans for you, alliances he hopes to cement through marriage to the daughter of one of his allies." "I know," Halvard sighed. "Politics and strategy, the endless machinations that governed the lives of those born to power and influence. Jarl Tormod's daughter, Brynhild. Father's been hinting at it for months now. She's beautiful and accomplished, exactly the kind of match that would strengthen our position." "She is all those things," Sigrun agreed, "and she would make you a perfectly acceptable wife, one who would fit seamlessly into our world and our ways. But Halvard, I've watched you with her at the gatherings we've attended. There's no spark there, no connection beyond polite interest. You deserve more than acceptable. You deserve someone who makes your heart race and your spirit soar." The winter months passed with agonizing slowness. Halvard threw himself into the work of managing his father's holdings, training warriors, settling disputes, planning the spring raiding season. He went through the motions of his regular life while a part of him remained frozen, suspended in anticipation of the moment when he could return to Rowena's village. He saw Brynhild several times at various gatherings and feasts. She was indeed beautiful, with dark hair and striking features, intelligent conversation, and impeccable manners. Under different circumstances, he might have been content to marry her, to build a comfortable life based on mutual respect if not passionate love. But every time he looked at her, he found himself comparing her to golden hair and fierce protective eyes, and Brynhild came up wanting through no fault of her own. Leif watched his friend's increasing restlessness with knowing eyes, occasionally offering sardonic comments about lovesickness and the follies of the heart. But he also began quietly preparing for the spring voyage, assembling a crew of men who could be trusted with discretion, who wouldn't question their leader's unusual motivations for returning to a village that had already paid its tribute. As the ice began to break up in the fjords and the first hints of spring warmth touched the Norwegian coast, Halvard made his preparations. He gathered gifts appropriate for an English village, practical items like iron tools and warm wool cloth, things that would be valuable without being ostentatious. He practiced what he might say, how he might explain his presence and his intentions, though every rehearsed speech sounded inadequate when he imagined actually speaking the words. The night before his planned departure, his father summoned him to the private chamber where Gunnar conducted the business of leadership away from the public eye of the Great Hall. Halvard entered with some trepidation, suspecting this conversation had been inevitable, but hoping it might have been delayed a while longer. Gunnar sat in his carved chair, a cup of mead untouched on the table beside him, his expression unreadable. "Your mother tells me you plan to return to the English village, the one you raided last autumn. She also tells me it's not just about collecting tribute." There was no point in lying to his father, who had an uncanny ability to detect deception and a marked intolerance for it. No, father, it's not just about tribute, though I will collect what's owed, as agreed. There's a woman there I wish to know better. An English woman, Gunnar said, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. A Christian widow with children. Have I understood the situation correctly? You have, Halvard confirmed, meeting his father's gaze steadily. I know it's not what you had planned for me. I know Jarl Tormod's daughter would be a more advantageous match politically. But father, I've never asked you for much. I've served you loyally, led successful raids, brought honor to our family name. I'm asking now for the freedom to pursue this, to see if it might lead somewhere meaningful. Gunnar was silent for a long moment, studying his youngest son with the intensity of a man who had built his power on accurately reading people and situations. Finally he sighed, and some of the sternness left his expression. Your mother said you'd inherited her stubbornness along with her looks. I see now she was right. Very well, Halvard. Go, pursue this English widow. See if your heart leads you true or leads you astray. Relief flooded through Halvard, though he tried not to show it too obviously. Thank you, father. I know this isn't what you wanted. What I want, Gunnar said, is for my sons to be happy and fulfilled. Yes, advantageous marriages serve the family interests, and yes, I had hoped you might cement an alliance with Tormod through marriage to his daughter. But I'm also old enough to know that forcing unwilling hearts together rarely leads to anything good. If this English woman is what you need, then pursue her with my blessing. But Halvard, his expression hardened slightly, if it doesn't work out, if she rejects you or you discover it was merely infatuation after all, then you'll return and seriously consider the matches I propose. Agreed? Agreed, Halvard said without hesitation. It was a fair bargain, more than fair actually. His father was giving him freedom to follow his heart while also maintaining realistic expectations about the family's needs and obligations. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect sailing weather. Halvard's crew assembled at the ship, a smaller group than the previous raid since this journey had different purposes. Leif was there, of course, and a dozen other trusted men who had proven their discretion and loyalty over years of shared adventures. As they prepared to cast off, Sigrun appeared on the dock, a small bundle in her hands. She approached her son with a smile that held both encouragement and concern. Something for you to give your English widow, if the opportunity arises. It belonged to my mother, and to her mother before her. I've been saving it for when it felt right, and somehow this feels right. Halvard accepted the bundle, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a beautiful silver brooch, intricate knotwork surrounding a central stone of deep amber. It was a piece of considerable value. But more than that, it was a family heirloom, a symbol of acceptance and welcome. His throat tightened with emotion. Mother, I can't take this. It's too precious. Which is exactly why you should take it, Sigrun insisted. If this woman is as special as you believe, she deserves to know she's welcomed into this family, that I see her worth through your eyes. And Halvard, if she accepts it, if she accepts you, then bring her home. I want to meet the woman who finally captured my son's heart. Halvard embraced his mother tightly, overwhelmed by her support and understanding. Then he boarded the ship, and the crew pushed off from the dock, oars biting into the water as they began the journey south once more. The voyage took 4 days, same as before, though this time Halvard found himself even more impatient with the passage of time. Every hour seemed to stretch into eternity, every delay caused by wind or tide an unbearable frustration. He spent long hours at the prow, watching the horizon as if he could will their destination to appear through sheer force of desire. When they finally spotted the English coast, Halvard's heart began racing with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that was entirely foreign to his usual pre-raid confidence. This was different from any battle he had ever faced, more terrifying in its own way because the stakes felt infinitely more personal. They beached the ship in the same location as before, the familiar stretch of sand and stone that lay north of the village. But this time, Halvard instructed most of his crew to remain with the ship. He would approach the village with only Leif and 2 others, a small enough group to appear non-threatening, large enough to ensure safety if things went unexpectedly wrong. As they crested the hill and the village came into view, Halvard felt his breath catch. It looked exactly as he remembered, as if the past 6 months had been merely a dream, and he was stepping back into that morning when everything had changed. Smoke rose from cooking fires, people moved about their daily tasks, livestock grazed in their pens. And somewhere in that collection of modest buildings was Rowena, the woman who had occupied his thoughts through the long winter months. The approach to the village this time felt entirely different from the raid 6 months prior. Then Halvard had moved with the confidence of a warrior assured of his purpose and his power. Now he walked with the uncertain steps of a man venturing into territory far more dangerous than any battlefield, armed with nothing but hope and a silver brooch wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked into his belt pouch. The first villager to spot them was a young boy tending sheep in a field near the village outskirts. The child's eyes went wide with recognition and fear, and he began running toward the village center, shouting warnings that carried clearly in the spring air. Within moments, the peaceful morning scene transformed into controlled chaos as people responded to the alarm, though this time with more organization than pure panic. Aldrich appeared quickly, moving with impressive speed for a man of his years, several other men flanking him. The headman's expression was guarded as he recognized Halvard, uncertainty warring with resignation in his weathered features. "Halvard Stormborn, we didn't expect you for another 6 months at least. Has something changed with our agreement?" "Nothing has changed," Halvard assured him, raising his hands to show he carried no weapons in them, that his sword and axe remained sheathed at his sides. "The tribute arrangement stands as agreed. I have not come to demand early payment or to alter our terms." "Then why have you come?" Aldrich asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and confusion. "Forgive my bluntness, Norseman, but raiders don't typically make social calls." Halvard felt heat rising in his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to identify as embarrassment. He was a warrior who had faced down armies, who had stared death in the face without flinching, and yet the prospect of explaining his presence here made him feel like an awkward boy. "I came to speak with someone, with Rowena, the widow, if she's willing to grant me an audience." The silence that followed his declaration was profound. Aldrich's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, disbelief, concern, and finally something that might have been cautious amusement. The men flanking him exchanged glances that spoke volumes, their shock evident in their slack-jawed expressions. "You've sailed 4 days across the sea," Aldrich said slowly, as if testing the reality of the words as he spoke them. "To speak with Rowena? Just to speak with her?" "Yes," Halvard confirmed, feeling increasingly foolish but refusing to back down now that he had committed himself. "I realize this is unusual. I realize I have no right to ask for her time or attention, but I would consider it a great favor if you would at least ask her if she's willing to see me. If she refuses, I'll accept her decision and depart immediately." Aldrich studied him for a long moment, his sharp old eyes seeming to peer into Halvard's very soul, weighing intentions and sincerity. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Wait here. I'll speak with her. But Halvard Stormborn, if your intentions toward her are anything less than honorable, if you mean her any harm or dishonor, you'll find that even old farmers can be dangerous when protecting one of their own." "My intentions are entirely honorable," Halvard said firmly. "You have my word on that, as you had my word on the tribute arrangement, and I've proven I keep my promises." The headman grunted acknowledgement of that truth, then turned and made his way deeper into the village, leaving Halvard and his companions standing awkwardly at the village edge under the watchful and suspicious eyes of the assembled villagers. Leif moved closer to his friend, his voice low enough that only Halvard could hear. "Well, you've certainly made an impression. Look at them staring at us like we've grown second heads. I don't think they know what to make of a Viking who comes courting instead of raiding." "I don't know what to make of it myself," Halvard admitted quietly. "What am I doing, Leif? This is madness. I should turn around right now, get back on the ship, and forget this whole foolish endeavor." "You could," Leif agreed, "but you won't. We both know you won't. You've come too far, invested too much to turn back now. See it through, my friend. At least then you'll know, one way or another." The minutes stretched out with agonizing slowness, while Halvard waited for Aldrich's return. He was acutely aware of every eye upon him, of the whispers passing between villagers as they tried to make sense of this unprecedented situation. He kept his posture relaxed, non-threatening, his hands visible and away from his weapons, trying to project peaceful intentions through body language since words seemed inadequate. Finally, Aldrich reappeared, and Halvard's heart leaped into his throat as he saw a second figure following behind the headman. Rowena. She walked with her head held high, that same dignity and quiet strength he remembered, though her expression was guarded and uncertain. She wore a simple dress of green wool that brought out golden highlights in her hair, which was partially covered by a white linen headcloth, as was proper for a respectable widow. Even from a distance, Halvard could see the tension in her shoulders, the wariness in her eyes as she approached the group of Norse warriors. She was even more beautiful than he remembered. 6 months of memory had not exaggerated or embellished, had not created something that didn't exist. If anything, his recollections had been pale shadows of the reality, unable to capture the true impact of her presence, the way she moved with unconscious grace, the intelligence and strength evident in every line of her face. Aldrich stopped a few paces away, Rowena beside him, and made the introductions with formal courtesy that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. "Rowena, this is Halvard Stormborn, the Norse raider who arranged the tribute agreement with our village last autumn. Halvard, this is Rowena, widow of Edmund the farmer, mother of Thomas and little Margaret." "I remember who he is," Rowena said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been fear or anger or both. It was the first time Halvard had heard her speak, and the sound of it struck him like a physical thing. Her voice was lower than he had expected, musical despite the obvious tension, with an accent that shaped the words in ways that were foreign but utterly captivating. "The man who came with armed warriors and threatened to take everything we had if we didn't submit to his demands." The words were harsh, accusatory, and entirely justified. Halvard felt them land like blows, each one a reminder of the gulf between them, of the way their first encounter had been marked by his power and her vulnerability. He had no defense to offer, no justification that would erase that fundamental imbalance. "You're right," he said simply, meeting her eyes despite the urge to look away from the judgment he saw there. "That's exactly what I did. I came to your village as a raider, threatened your home and your people, demanded tribute under threat of violence. I won't insult you by trying to soften those facts or excuse my actions." Rowena's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such direct acknowledgement. Some of the tension in her posture eased fractionally, though she remained on guard. "Then why are you here now? The tribute isn't due for months yet. What more do you want from us?" "I want nothing from the village," Halvard said, his heart hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. "I came to speak with you if you're willing. Just to talk, to get to know you, to see if perhaps we might find some common ground despite the circumstances of our first meeting." "Common ground," Rowena repeated, her tone skeptical. "Between a Viking raider and an English farmer's widow? What possible common ground could we have?" It was a fair question, one Halvard had asked himself countless times during the long winter months. He had rehearsed various answers, eloquent speeches that would somehow bridge the divide between them. But standing here now, looking into her eyes and seeing the mix of fear and defiance and curiosity there, all his prepared words fled, and he was left with only raw honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe none. Maybe I've spent 6 months building up something in my head that has no basis in reality. But Rowena, when I saw you last autumn, something changed in me. I can't explain it properly, can barely understand it myself. But I knew that if I didn't at least try to know you, to see if what I felt had any foundation, I would regret it for the rest of my life." He saw her expression shift, surprise breaking through the defensive walls she had erected. Around them, the assembled villagers had gone silent, straining to hear this unprecedented conversation between the widow and the raider. Even Leif and the other Norse warriors were watching with rapt attention, as invested in the outcome as if their own hearts were on the line. "You felt something," Rowena said slowly, testing the words. "When you saw me. 6 months ago, for perhaps a few moments total, you felt something that brought you back across the sea." "Yes," Halvard confirmed, knowing how inadequate that single word was to convey the depths of what he had experienced, but unable to find better language for it. Rowena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if looking for deception or hidden motives. Finally she said, "I have children, Master Halvard, a son of 7 winters and a daughter of 5. They are my first priority, my primary responsibility. Whatever you think you felt, whatever you imagine might develop between us, it cannot come at the expense of their safety or well-being. I would never ask it to," Halvard said fervently. "Your children should be your priority. Any man worthy of your time would understand and respect that. I'm not asking you to abandon your responsibilities or to trust me immediately. I'm simply asking for the chance to prove that I'm worth knowing, that perhaps, In time, you might come to see me as something other than the raider who threatened your village. And if I refuse? Rowena asked, her tone not hostile but genuinely curious. If I tell you to leave and never return, will you honor that decision? Or will you use your power to force the issue? I'll leave immediately and never trouble you again, Halvard promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. You have my word, Rowena. The same word I gave your headman about the tribute arrangement. The same word I've built my reputation upon. I'm asking for your time and attention, not demanding it. The choice is entirely yours. Rowena glanced at Aldrich, some silent communication passing between them. The old headman gave a slight nod, perhaps offering reassurance or permission, or simply acknowledgement that this was her decision to make. Then she turned back to Halvard, her expression still guarded, but with something new flickering in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or curiosity, or simply the willingness to take a chance on something unexpected. Very well, she said finally, the words seeming to surprise her as much as they delighted Halvard. You may call on me, here, in the village, in public where I feel safe, and where others can see that all remains proper. We'll talk, and I'll decide whether you're someone worth knowing, or just a raider with pretty words and false intentions. Relief and joy flooded through Halvard with such intensity that he felt momentarily lightheaded. She was giving him a chance, an opportunity to prove himself, to show her that what he felt was real and worthy of consideration. It was more than he had dared hope for, more than he deserved, given how they had met. Thank you, he said, unable to keep the emotion from his voice. You won't regret this. I promise you that. I'll be the judge of whether I regret it or not, Rowena replied, but there was the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, the first crack in her defensive armor. When did you wish to call? Is tomorrow too soon? Halvard asked, then immediately worried that he was being too eager, too pushy. Or if you need more time to prepare, to think about this, I can wait. I have nowhere else to be. Nothing more important than this. Rowena considered his request for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Tomorrow afternoon, she said finally, after the midday meal. Come to my home, but bring only one of your men if you must have a companion. I'll not have a house full of armed warriors frightening my children. Just Leif, Halvard agreed immediately. My second in command and oldest friend. He's harmless, I promise. Behind him, he heard Leif snort at that characterization, but his friend said nothing to contradict it. With the arrangement made, Rowena gave him a final appraising look, then turned and walked back toward her home, her posture straight and dignified despite what must have been tremendous nervousness about what she had just agreed to. Halvard watched her go, his eyes following her until she disappeared inside her modest dwelling, and he felt something settle in his chest, a rightness that he had never experienced before. Aldrich approached him once Rowena had left, his expression a mixture of warning and grudging approval. You've been given something precious, Norseman. Rowena doesn't trust easily, especially not men, especially not after losing Edmund. The fact that she's willing to see you at all speaks to either courage or foolishness on her part. I'm not sure which. I won't waste the opportunity, Halvard assured him, and I won't do anything to make her regret her decision. See that you don't, Aldrich said firmly, because if you hurt her, if you dishonor her or bring her any harm, you'll have more to worry about than one old headman's anger. This entire village loves Rowena. She's helped every family here at one time or another, tended the sick-minded children, shared what little she had when others had even less. You hurt her, and you'll make enemies of everyone who calls this place home. Understood, Halvard said, respecting the old man's protective instincts. But I have no intention of hurting her. Quite the opposite. The rest of that day and the long night that followed were an exercise in patience and mounting anxiety. Halvard returned to the ship where his crew had set up a temporary camp on the beach. He tried to occupy himself with various tasks, checking equipment, discussing potential trading opportunities with Leif, anything to make the hours pass more quickly. But his mind remained stubbornly fixed on the coming meeting, alternating between eager anticipation and near-paralyzing nervousness. You're worse than a green boy before his first battle, Leif observed with amusement as Halvard paced the beach for what must have been the 100th time. I've never seen you this agitated, not even when we were outnumbered 3-1 off the coast of Frisia. This is more terrifying than any battle, Halvard admitted. In battle, I know what I'm doing. I have skills and experience and confidence in my abilities. But this, I have no idea what I'm doing, Leif. What if I say the wrong thing? What if she decides I'm not worth her time after all? What if I've come all this way only to discover that what I felt was one-sided, that she could never see me as anything other than the raider who threatened her home? Then you'll have your answer and you can move on with your life, Leif said pragmatically. But, Halvard, did you see the way she looked at you? Beneath all that justified wariness and caution, there was curiosity there. Interest even. She could have refused to see you at all, but she didn't. That means something. Or it means she's simply being polite, trying to avoid offending someone who has power over her village's safety. You're determined to think the worst, aren't you? Leif shook his head. Listen to me, my friend. You're a good man. Despite making your living as a raider, you're honorable, intelligent, not terrible to look at despite that scar. You have prospects, family connections, wealth. Any woman would be fortunate to have your attention. Stop acting like you're unworthy of hers and start believing that you have something valuable to offer. The words helped, though Halvard's nervousness didn't fully dissipate. He spent a sleepless night rehearsing possible conversations, imagining scenarios both wonderful and disastrous, until exhaustion finally claimed him in the hours before dawn. He woke feeling gritty-eyed and irritable, snapping at his men over minor issues until Leif physically pulled him aside and told him to get control of himself before he alienated his entire crew. Finally, mercifully, the afternoon arrived. Halvard bathed in the cold seawater, scrubbing away travel grime and trying to make himself presentable. He changed into his best clothing, a deep blue tunic embroidered at the collar and cuffs, dark trousers, and his good leather boots. He combed his hair and beard, checking his reflection in Leif's polished shield and feeling ridiculous for caring so much about his appearance. You look fine, Leif assured him. Stop fussing like a maiden before her wedding. Remember, you're Halvard Stormborn, son of a jarl, successful raider and warrior. Act like it. They made their way to the village in the early afternoon, the spring sun warm on their shoulders, new growth greening the fields and budding on the trees. The village was quieter than the day before, most people going about their work with only occasional glances toward the two Norsemen walking through their settlement. Halvard was grateful for the relative lack of attention, though he suspected that eyes were watching from windows and doorways. That word of where he was going and why would spread through the village like wildfire. Rowena's home looked exactly as he remembered, modest but well-maintained, with the small garden now showing the first shoots of spring planting. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of cooking food and wood fire. As they approached, the door opened and Rowena stepped out, and Halvard felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, he could tell. Her gown was a soft blue that complemented her golden hair, which she wore partially braided but mostly loose down her back. It was a more relaxed style than the previous day, when she had covered her hair in the manner of proper widows. The change felt significant somehow, a small signal that she was willing to present herself as more than just Edmund's widow, that she was allowing herself to be seen as Rowena the woman. Master Halvard, she greeted him, her voice steadier than it had been yesterday, though he could still detect underlying nervousness. And this must be Leif? Aye, lady, Leif said with a bow that was more courtly than his usual rough manners might suggest. Leif the Red at your service. I'm here merely as chaperone and witness to propriety. I'll make myself scarce if you prefer. Just within earshot, but out of sight. That would be appreciated, Rowena said, and there was genuine gratitude in her expression. She understood that Leif's presence protected her reputation while giving her and Halvard space for private conversation. There's a bench by the garden wall. You're welcome to wait there. Leif nodded and moved to the indicated location, positioning himself where he could intervene if needed but far enough away to grant them privacy. Rowena turned back to Halvard, uncertainty flickering across her features before she seemed to steel herself with visible effort. Would you like to walk? She asked. There's a path that leads to a meadow just beyond the village. It's pleasant this time of year, and we could talk more freely there than here with half the village trying to listen through walls. I'd like that very much, Halvard agreed, pleased that she felt comfortable enough to suggest leaving the immediate safety of the village center. It spoke to at least minimal trust, or perhaps simply to her desire for honest conversation away from prying eyes and ears. They began walking, Leif following at a discreet distance, far enough back to give them privacy, but close enough to fulfill his protective role. For the first few minutes, neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Halvard searched desperately for the right words to break the ice, to begin building the connection he so desperately wanted. It was Rowena who finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. I didn't sleep last night. I kept asking myself why I agreed to this. What madness possessed me to give audience to a Viking raider who appeared out of nowhere claiming to have feelings for a woman he'd never even spoken to? Did you come to any conclusions? Halvard asked, trying to keep his tone light despite the tension coiling in his gut. Several, she admitted. None of them entirely satisfactory. But I think, ultimately, I agreed because I was curious. You're not what I expected a raider to be. The stories we hear paint you Norsemen as monsters, brutal and cruel, interested only in violence and plunder. But you negotiated peacefully with Aldrich, kept your word about the tribute, and now you've returned with no demands, except to talk with me. It doesn't fit the stories. Stories are rarely accurate, Halvard said. They simplify, exaggerate, turn complex people into simple archetypes. Yes, I'm a raider. Yes, I've done things in my life that I'm not proud of, taken from people who couldn't defend themselves. But I'm also a man who loves his mother, who values loyalty and honor, who keeps his promises and tries to be better than the worst examples of my people. They reached the meadow she had mentioned, a lovely open space filled with wildflowers and tall grass, a stream running along one edge with water so clear Halvard could see the stones on the bottom. Rowena led him to a fallen log near the stream, brushing it off before sitting down and gesturing for him to join her. He sat, careful to maintain respectful distance between them, acutely aware of her proximity and the sweet scent of herbs that clung to her clothing. Tell me about yourself, Rowena said, turning slightly to face him. Not the raider, not the Jarl's son, just Halvard. Who are you when you're not playing those roles? The question was unexpected and disarming in its directness. Halvard found himself speaking more honestly than he had intended, the words flowing freely as he described his childhood in Norway, his complicated relationship with his older brother, his love for the sea and the freedom it represented. He told her about his mother's wisdom and his father's high expectations, about the pressure of being second-born, and the drive to prove himself worthy despite never being able to inherit his father's position. Rowena listened with genuine attention, asking occasional questions that showed she was truly interested rather than merely being polite. And slowly, gradually, Halvard felt the conversation becoming more balanced as she began to share her own story. She spoke of her childhood in this village, of meeting Edmund when she was barely 16, of falling in love with his gentle nature and steady reliability. She described the joy of having children, the terror and wonder of motherhood, and then the devastating loss when fever had taken Edmund 2 winters past, leaving her alone with 2 small children and a farm to manage. The first year was the hardest, she said softly, her eyes distant with memory. I didn't think I could survive it. Every task felt impossible. Every day was a struggle just to get through. But I had Thomas and Margaret depending on me, and I couldn't let them down. So I learned to do things I never thought I could do. I learned to plow and plant, to repair tools and mend fences, to be both mother and father to my children. You're remarkable, Halvard said, the words inadequate but sincere. Truly remarkable, Rowena. The strength it must have taken to not only survive but to build a life for your family in the face of such loss. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Halvard saw the defensive wall she had built around herself beginning to crack. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Of all the women you must have encountered in your travels, why did I capture your attention? I'm just a widow trying to survive. Nothing special or extraordinary. You're wrong about that, Halvard said, leaning slightly closer, drawn by invisible threads toward her warmth and light. There's something extraordinary about you, Rowena. Something that called to me the moment I saw you. The way you stood in your doorway protecting your children, ready to fight the world if necessary to keep them safe. The dignity and strength you carry despite all the burdens life has placed on your shoulders. The kindness Aldrich described. The way you've helped everyone in your village even when you had so little yourself. He paused, searching for the right words to convey what he felt. I've been to hundreds of villages, seen countless beautiful women, but I've never felt what I felt when I looked at you. It was like recognition, like some part of me had been searching for you my entire life without knowing it. I can't explain it rationally, can only tell you that it's real and powerful, and unlike anything I've experienced before. Rowena's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears, her breath coming faster as emotion washed over her features. I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid to trust this, to trust you, to let myself feel anything beyond what's safe and familiar. Edmund was my world, and when I lost him, I thought I'd lost my capacity to love anyone that way again. I've been content to simply survive, to focus on my children and let that be enough. It's all right to be afraid, Halvard said gently. I'm afraid too. Terrified, actually. Afraid that I'll disappoint you, that I won't be what you need, that this feeling I have will turn out to be one-sided. But Rowena, I think sometimes we have to be brave enough to reach for something precious even when we're scared, because the alternative is to let fear keep us from ever truly living again. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the babbling of the stream and the singing of birds in the nearby trees. Halvard became aware that the distance between them had somehow shrunk, that Rowena had shifted closer without either of them consciously deciding to move. Her hand rested on the log between them, pale and delicate, and he found himself reaching out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let his larger, calloused hand cover hers, and the simple contact sent electricity racing up Halvard's arm. For a long moment, they simply sat like that, hands touching, a bridge beginning to form across the gulf that separated their worlds. I can't promise you anything, Rowena said finally, her voice trembling slightly. I can't promise that I'm ready for whatever this might become. I can't promise that my heart is capable of healing enough to let someone new in. But Halvard, I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give this a chance, to see where it might lead. Joy exploded in Halvard's chest, so intense it was almost painful. That's all I'm asking for, he said. Just a chance. Time to know each other properly, to see if what we feel has the potential to grow into something lasting and real. Then you'll need to stay, Rowena said, a small smile finally breaking through her serious expression. You can't court someone from across the sea, visiting once every 6 months to collect tribute. If we're going to do this, you need to be here, where I can see that your actions match your words, where my children can come to know you, where we can build something genuine rather than imagined. The practical implications of what she was suggesting hit Halvard like a wave. Stay here, in England, away from his home and family and everything familiar. It would mean explaining to his father, dealing with the political ramifications, perhaps even giving up his position in Norwegian society. It was a tremendous sacrifice, one that would change the entire trajectory of his life. And yet, looking into Rowena's eyes, seeing the hope and fear and possibility reflected there, Halvard found that he didn't need time to think about it. The answer was obvious, written in the certainty that had seized him the moment he first saw her. Then I'll stay, he said simply, for as long as it takes, for as long as you'll have me. I'll send most of my crew back to Norway with messages from my father. Keep just a few men here for safety and propriety. We can build a camp near the village, close enough that I can court you properly, but far enough to not make your neighbors uncomfortable with a Norse presence. Rowena's smile widened, transforming her entire face and making Halvard's heart stutter in his chest. You're serious. You'd actually do that? Give up everything familiar for an uncertain chance with a widow you barely know? Without hesitation, Halvard confirmed. Because, Rowena, you're not uncertain to me. You're the most certain thing I've ever felt. Everything else in my life has been about duty and expectation and proving myself. But this, what I feel for you, it's the first thing that's ever felt like choice. Like something I'm doing purely because it's what my heart demands, regardless of logic or practicality. Tears spilled over then, running down Rowena's cheeks as she struggled with the overwhelming emotion of the moment. Halvard reached up gently, brushing the tears away with his thumb, and she leaned into the touch, her eyes closing as if savoring the simple comfort of human contact. My children, she said after a moment, her eyes opening again. You need to meet them properly. Spend time with them. If this is going to work, they have to accept you, to feel safe and comfortable with your presence. Thomas remembers his father well, and he's been protective of me since Edmund died. Margaret is too young to remember Edmund clearly, but she's shy with strangers. Winning them over won't be easy. I wouldn't expect it to be, Halvard said. Children are wise in ways adults often aren't. They'll judge me based on who I am, and how I treat them and their mother, not on my title or reputation. That's as it should be. I'll do whatever it takes to earn their trust, Rowena. Whatever it takes to prove to them that I mean only good things for your family. They talked until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, hours passing like minutes as they shared stories and dreams and fears. Halvard learned about Rowena's love of herbs and healing. The small garden where she grew plants used to tend the sick in the village. She learned about his mother's teachings on leadership and compassion, the values that had shaped him despite the violence of his chosen profession. They discovered shared loves of music and storytelling, debates about the nature of the gods that were spirited but respectful of their different faiths. When they finally walked back to the village as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Halvard felt as though he were walking on air. Leif fell into step beside them, his expression knowing but mercifully free of teasing commentary. At Rowena's door, Halvard stopped, suddenly remembering the gift his mother had given him. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his belt pouch and withdrawing the carefully wrapped bundle. "It's from my mother, actually. She wanted you to have it, as a symbol of welcome and acceptance." Rowena unwrapped the cloth with careful fingers, gasping softly when she revealed the beautiful silver brooch within. "Halvard, this is too much. It's clearly an heirloom, something that should stay in your family." "My mother hopes it will stay in the family," Halvard said gently, "just perhaps not in the way you're thinking. She wanted you to know that if you accept me, you'll also be accepting a place in our family, that you'll be welcomed and valued." Fresh tears welled in Rowena's eyes as she clutched the brooch to her chest. "Tell your mother thank you when you send your messages north. Tell her that I'm honored by this gift and by the acceptance it represents." "I will," Halvard promised. Then, gathering his courage, he reached for her hand again, raising it to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "May I call on you again tomorrow? And the day after? And the day after that? For as many days as you'll allow?" "Yes," Rowena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Halvard. Come tomorrow. Come every day. We have so much to learn about each other, so much to explore and discover." Over the following weeks, Halvard established his camp near the village with a small group of trusted men, sending Leif and most of the crew back to Norway with carefully written messages for his parents explaining his decision. The initial shock and suspicion from the villagers gradually gave way to cautious acceptance as they watched Halvard court Rowena with patience and respect. As they saw him interact gently with her children, helping Thomas learn to use a practice sword, and telling Margaret stories that made her giggle with delight. The courtship was slow and careful, both of them aware of the weight of their pasts and the complexity of their situation. But day by day, conversation by conversation, shared meal by shared laughter, something beautiful began to grow between them. Rowena's defensive walls crumbled piece by piece as Halvard proved himself worthy of her trust. Thomas gradually warmed to this large Norse warrior who treated him with respect and taught him skills his father never had the chance to impart. Margaret simply decided that Halvard belonged, claiming him as her friend with the uncomplicated acceptance of young children. Summer arrived, bringing warm days and long evenings perfect for walks through the meadow, where they had first truly connected. Halvard helped with the harvest, his strength making quick work of tasks that would have taken Rowena days to complete alone. The village grew accustomed to his presence, several farmers even seeking his advice on matters of defense and organization, surprised to find that the fearsome raider was also a thoughtful strategist with valuable knowledge to share. And through it all, what had begun as attraction deepened into genuine love. Halvard discovered that the reality of Rowena was even better than the image that had haunted him. Her quick intelligence challenged him. Her compassion humbled him. Her strength inspired him. She was his equal in every way that mattered, a partner who could stand beside him rather than behind him. Rowena, for her part, found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. Edmund's memory remained precious, a part of her history that she would always honor. But Halvard opened possibilities for the future, showed her that loving again didn't diminish what she had felt before, that her heart was capable of holding both grief for what was lost and joy for what might be found. One evening in late summer, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Halvard took Rowena's hand and spoke the words that had been building in his heart for months. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because it's practical or advantageous, not because of duty or obligation. Marry me because I love you with everything I am, because I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, because I want to be a father to Thomas and Margaret and help you raise them into the remarkable people I know they'll become." Rowena turned to him, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, Halvard, I'll marry you. I'll bind my life to yours and trust that together we can build something beautiful from the most unlikely of beginnings." They married in the early autumn, a ceremony that blended Norse and Christian traditions, witnessed by the entire village and the handful of Norse warriors who had remained with Halvard. Messages had arrived from Norway carrying Gunnar and Sigrun's blessings, along with gifts that acknowledged Rowena as a daughter of their house. The celebration lasted 3 days, joy and music filling the village as two people from different worlds chose to create a new world together. Halvard sent word north that he would not be returning to Norway permanently, that he had found his place and his purpose here with Rowena and her children. He arranged for his share of the family wealth to be sent south, using it to purchase land adjacent to Rowena's farm, expanding their holdings and securing their future prosperity. He became a bridge between the Norse and English communities, facilitating peaceful trade and cultural exchange, proving that understanding could grow where fear had once thrived. Years passed, bringing children of their own to add to their family, Thomas and Margaret growing strong and confident with Halvard as their father in all ways that mattered. The tribute arrangement evolved into genuine partnership, the village prospering under the protection and trade connections Halvard provided. His reputation spread, the tale of the powerful Viking who had gone to plunder a village, but instead found love becoming the stuff of legend, told and retold with embellishments around countless hearths. On a spring morning 10 years after that first fateful raid, Halvard stood in the doorway of their expanded home, watching Rowena work in her now extensive herb garden while their youngest daughter played at her feet. Thomas, nearly grown now, worked in the fields with the confidence of a young man who knew his worth and his place in the world. Margaret helped her mother, her golden hair so like Rowena's catching the sunlight. Leif, visiting from Norway with news from Halvard's family, came to stand beside his friend. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About the life you left behind, the position you gave up?" Halvard looked at his wife, his children, the life they had built together from the most improbable of beginnings. He thought of that morning 10 years ago when a glimpse of a golden-haired widow had changed everything, when his heart had recognized something his mind couldn't yet understand. "Not a single one," he said truthfully. "I came to plunder and found treasure beyond anything I could have imagined. I came as a raider and became a husband, a father, a man finally at peace with himself and his purpose. How could I possibly regret trading violence and uncertainty for love and belonging?" Rowena looked up then, as if sensing his gaze, and smiled at him with a warmth that still had the power to stop his heart. He smiled back, and in that exchange of looks laden with shared history and deep affection, the story found its perfect ending. The powerful Viking who had gone to plunder a village had indeed changed, transformed not by magic or divine intervention, but by the most powerful force in existence, the love of a courageous woman who had been brave enough to see past fear to possibility, who had given a raider the chance to become something better, who had proven that even the most unlikely love stories could have the happiest of endings.